Welcome everyone to the Nonprofit Leadership Center 2025 webinar series. Today we'll be having the Effectively Navigating the Legislative Landscape for Nonprofits webinar with Leah McDermott from Florida Nonprofit Alliance. Leah is the program director for the FNA. And I'm gonna go over the rules of the road to minimize background noise and distractions. All lines will be muted for the duration of the webinar. Of course, if there's anything that you want some clarification on or something like that, feel free to unmute yourself and bring that up. This session is being recorded and will be available on our website for future viewing. We will also be sharing the slides once we post the webinar. You may have noticed I have live captions enabled as an accessibility feature. If you find them distracting, there is a way to remove them or disable them on the bottom of the screen. We warmly welcome your questions. You can type them in the chat box as they come to you. At the end of the webinar, we will have about 10 to 15 minutes for Leah to answer them. And then we are so delighted to have you, Leah, today and look forward to a great informative webinar. On to you.
Great. Thank you, Isabella. I appreciate it and really happy to be here with all of you today. As she said, my name is Leah McDermott. I'm the program director for Florida Nonprofit Alliance. We are the state association for nonprofits in Florida. We spend most of our time in the public policy and advocacy space, so both advocating on behalf of nonprofits at the federal, state, and to some degree local government, but also making sure nonprofits understand how to legally and ethically advocate for themselves, as well as providing statewide research that we feel like strengthens your messaging when you're talking about the work that you're doing in your local community. So if you would like to learn more about us, I think the best way to do that is our website, which is flnonprofits.org. Because we are the state association, we are also a member of the National Council of Nonprofits, which not only gives us our boots on the ground lobbying in DC, but also connects us with the other state associations around the country. There's about 44 of them. So we get to share all the great work happening in Florida, but also learn from our counterparts in other states as well. So really happy to be here with you all. NLC is a great partner of ours. We really admire all the work that they're doing in the Tampa Bay area and are happy to be here today. So the plan today is to talk a little bit about what we're seeing, especially at the federal and state level, for what's affecting nonprofits currently. I will put a caveat in there that there's a lot going on, and I couldn't possibly be an expert in all of the things that are happening. But please do put your questions in the chat as we go through this next section. If I don't know the answer today, I'm happy to follow up with that and give that to Isabella. She can share it out with everyone who attended today. Or if you have a more individual question, I'll share my contact information at the end. Happy to have a more one-on-one conversation. After that, we're going to move into a little bit of what is advocacy, how can you do it for your organization, what do you need to know about the legalities and ethics of it. So we'll wrap up with that and then have some time for questions at the end. So this first section here is about what we're seeing at the federal level, specifically with executive orders. As I mentioned, there's a lot on the screen, there's a lot happening every day. So it would be impossible to kind of go through every line item and every bullet here, but there may be some that you're not aware of. So just wanted to draw those to your attention so that you can do a little bit follow-up research and figure out for yourselves how much it might affect your particular organization. I will also say the National Council of Nonprofits has a chart that they've been updating on a regular basis that is tracking a lot of these executive orders, and I'll be happy to put that link in the chat in just a little bit. So some of the things that we're seeing from the White House, right? So they're specifically executive orders that President Trump is putting forth right now. There is some target of the census to only count citizens of the United States rather than all people living in the United States. This was something that was attempted under President Biden, but was shot down in the courts. Now we have this new executive order that's saying that's the case. The census is not till 2030, so we still have a few years to go. And not sure if this one is also going to be challenged or not. A big focus from the federal government around DEI, around LGBTQ, around immigration. If you work in one of those areas, you probably seen a lot, heard a lot, are having lots of conversations about this already. And specifically in the case of DEI, what we're noticing is that there's a lot of very broad language that doesn't define a lot of the terms that the federal government is using. So a little bit of work to do there to see how it's actually going to affect some of our organizations. Some of that legislation also being challenged in federal court. About 2 weeks ago, President Trump set down an executive order to shut down as much of the Department of Education as legally possible. So we've seen a lot of layoffs from that, moving different responsibilities around to other departments, potentially. A focus on removing some of the environmental funds, even ones that were allocated by the previous administration and approved by Congress. There's some attacking of that money there. I'm sure you all have heard about the federal funds freeze. That's one of the first ones that came down after his inauguration. That one is being challenged in federal court by the National Council of Nonprofits. In addition to that, there's been some language that all grants and contracts should be reviewed to make sure they fit in with the priorities of the administration. So we're not sure exactly how that will affect nonprofits yet, but that is a mandate that the federal departments have been given. Most recently, we see some concerning language around free and fair elections, not only about who has access to vote and what kind of proof of citizenship you have to show there, but there's also specifically some language that looks like it might try to remove the right of nonprofits to advocate if they receive any federal funds, which would definitely go against all current laws and sort of precedent that we've seen there. So that's something that we're watching closely. We've seen some freezing of food assistance programs and international aid. And then also, if you have employees at your organization that are repaying student loans, they may be enrolled in something called the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. So this is targeted for teachers, civil servants, nonprofit employees working for qualified agencies. As long as they repay on their federal approved repayment plan for 10 years, the remainder of their loans can be forgiven if they meet all the criteria. Looks like there's going to be some challenges to what organizations are considered to be approved to be in the organization. So we're watching that closely, probably targeting some in the DEI, LGBTQ, environment, immigration space. But we're also seeing that might move to a different place besides the Department of Education. So looking at how that might affect people's ability to get those repayment plans in place, which makes them qualified to be a part of the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. So watching that closely as well. I will say again, many of these executive orders are being challenged in court. Some of the courts have put stays on the executive orders while it moves through the system. Some have not. So it's changing all the time. If you have any specific questions, like I said, drop them in the chat. I'll do the best that I can and happy to follow up on any that I might not be able to answer today. At the other side of the federal level is, of course, our Congress, right? Congressional actions that may be taking place. In both houses, both chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate, the Republicans have small margins of control. So that means they can get through some things, but it may be difficult in other areas for Congress to accomplish a lot. So I think that's why we're seeing this focus on executive orders really early in President Trump's administration this time, and we'll see what happens when Congress is able to kind of take up some of the issues they have to struggle with. Of major note to us in the sector, a lot of the tax cuts from the 2017 Jobs and Tax Cut Act that was put forth in President Trump's first administration, a lot of those are going to be expiring. So we expect that Congress will have to wrestle with some of that, including standard deductions, which had an influence on charitable contributions. So all remain to be seen. We'll be sharing information about that, but that's kind of coming up. At the state level, a few things that we know is going on. The state legislature is currently meeting in their annual session. They started at the beginning of March. They should end at the beginning of May. A couple of things that we're seeing. One, Governor DeSantis did create a Florida Department of Governmental Efficiency office. Eric J. Soskin is leading that team. He came from the U.S. Department of Transportation, so he's housed within the government, within the governor's office to kind of lead this charge. This will probably have some effects at the local level as well. In fact, they've been a little bit strong-arming and saying, we expect all local governments to comply with any questions that we have about your efficiency as well. So we expect some maybe to give pushback, a lot to participate in this process. We've also heard from the new state attorney, James Othmeyer, that they may be looking at penalties for local governments who do not cooperate with the federal immigration enforcement that we're seeing come down from the federal level. A lot of that's being replicated in the state level and legislation there. And so if local governments are refusing to participate, they may see some penalties come across that way. In the legislature, a couple of bills that we are watching, and I will say for us at FNA, most of the time we are looking for those bills that are going to affect the sector as a whole. So if you are involved in advocacy at your organization already, there may be a lot of bills related to your subsector or your mission area that you are tracking very closely. We try to keep up with those and help you as much as possible, but the ones that we are really active with are ones that are going to affect the entire sector overall. So we do have House Bill 583. This is saying that agents of foreign principals and foreign supported political organizations must register with the Division of Elections and provide regular updates. This probably won't affect many of you, but if you are an organization that receives a lot of foreign aid, this is something you're going to want to keep a close eye on. We are also tracking Senate Bill 1710, which is prohibitions and limitations on DEI. It also has some requirements for medical institutions of higher education. So this is setting rules for state agencies applying for certain federal healthcare grants, banning state agencies from using certain funds for diversity, equity, inclusion officer, and requiring those applying for state contracts or grants to give specific certification to the chief finance officer that they are not doing DEI work. So if that is something that applies to you, if you've had a state contract in the past, keep an eye on that. The Honest Services Registry is included as part of House Bill 651. This is kind of an additional through the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, which is our regulating body at the state level, saying that you will attest that you are not receiving foreign money from certain foreign governments, right? So there's like a list of 5 governments that you're not allowed to take money from. They're going to ask you to attest to that, probably either through your solicitation permit for raising money or some other process that they have already set up at the state government. And then finally, we're keeping an eye on House Bill 1011, which gives the Secretary of the Department of State the role of Chief Arts and Culture Officer. This is coming down from, some of you may remember at the end of last year's session, the governor line item vetoed pretty much all of the arts and culture money out of the state budget because he was unhappy with a couple of the grants that were awarded or recommended to be awarded. This is their solution to that, is that the Secretary of the Department of State would take over this role, and it authorizes the Secretary to review the grant funding list to ensure that grant funds meet certain criteria. In addition to that, we're hearing some language from the Speaker of the House around cutting sales tax for the state, so lowering what the state level of sales tax would be. And he's saying it's not going to be a temporary measure. He's looking for a long-term decrease in that sales tax. We're also hearing a lot from the governor around his desire to cut the local government property taxes that are assessed on homeowners in Florida. No specific legislation or plan around that yet that we've seen, but both of those obviously would affect state revenue. We would probably be looking at cuts in other areas to make up for that. And it could also affect the grants and contracts for organizations that are getting state funding at this point in time. But more to come on all that. We don't really have a lot of details yet. The state budget must be approved by the end of session. So the subcommittees have been working to get out their proposed pieces. That's been rolled up into a House version and a Senate version. They have to agree before they can approve it, but that is well underway, and they are looking to try to make the budget smaller than last fiscal year. So a big focus on cutting expenses, making government lean, making sure that, as the speaker would tell you, that they're taking care to budget just like every household in Florida has to do for their own expenses. The other thing we're keeping an eye on is if we see copycat legislation happen, either something at the federal level that's copied at the state level, or we're also starting to see local governments copy some legislation that's being introduced at the state or federal level as well. So do make sure that you know how to track local legislation, either from the county that you are in, or if you have a municipality, a city or town or other, body that is making some rules or interacting with nonprofits in some way, that you know what they're talking about and that you're getting your voice heard if it's something that you're not comfortable with or you feel like it's going to impede your ability to provide your mission work. And then the last piece here is just recognizing that we are well into the 2026 election season now. We still will probably see a couple of special elections maybe before the end of this year. There were 2 congressional elections yesterday, special elections yesterday for Congressional District 1 and 6. That will leave the current CFO position empty, which Governor DeSantis will be able to appoint. It also leaves a state Senate seat open from Randy Fine, who will be moving to the US House. And we will need to have a special election for that. So still more to come in there. But we're also, as I said, well underway for 2026. So you can see on your screen there all the things that will be on the ballot in 2026, including the special election for the US Senate seat that Ashley Moody is currently fulfilling. Governor DeSantis appointed her a couple months ago. The governor and all of their cabinet, Governor DeSantis is term limited out, so that will be an open position there, along with your local elections, and then any statewide amendments that end up on the ballot. So if you are curious on how to check and see who is already filing to run, I'll share that link too a little bit later. So that's a lot, but that's kind of the landscape that we're living in right now. A lot of things coming at us, a lot of things changing quickly. If you do have any questions, as I said, drop those in the chat and I'll be happy to grab those as we go through. But I want to pivot a little bit here and talk about what this means, right? So how we take what we know about what's happening to nonprofits and change that to something that we have some control over and some power over. And that is through advocacy. As I told you at the beginning, Florida Nonprofit Alliance, this is a big part of our work. We spend a lot of time thinking about it, and we hope that you all are thinking about it as well, because advocacy is vitally important for our nonprofit sector and for our democracy. It's a founding principle of our country, something that was there from the very beginning, that Alexis de Tocqueville noticed when he came over from France to see what was going on here, that Americans are constantly forming associations, they're responding to problems, they're helping their neighbors, right? And there's very few long-term social issues that have changed without the influence of nonprofit organizations. You can see some examples there on your screen. It's also not just beneficial to the community at large, it also helps your organization. A lot of times, we've been tasked with really difficult work and solving social problems that are generations old. And there's only so much we can do through our current programs and services. At some point, you're going to kind of hit this boundary or this barrier where you say, we are, taking care of the symptoms, but not getting to the root of the problem. So advocacy provides you a different way to really get into the root of that problem, and it allows you to meet your mission in a separate way. Also, a lot of times it raises your profile and makes things like fundraising easier. It's also going to help those public policy makers. A lot of those people who run for elected office, they're just regular human beings, right? And they only know what they know. They have certain life experiences, they have education, they have jobs, but they are tasked with making decisions and voting on issues in every kind of category that you can imagine. There's no way that one person walks into that office ready to do that. And so we can provide some expertise to them, provide some research, data, understanding of what the problems are. We can connect them to the people that we serve who may not have traditionally had a voice in our advocacy system and our public policy system. And we can build this long-term, mutually beneficial relationship that not only helps us meet our mission, but also helps them be able to make educated decisions about what they're voting on. This, I think, is especially important as we look at what nonprofits are struggling with. A lot of this information here comes from our research. If Florida was a standalone economy, we would be the 15th largest economy in the world, according to the Florida Chamber of Commerce. And that does not happen if we do not have healthy and strong nonprofit organizations contributing to that economy. So that's very important for all of our elected officials to understand at every level of government, that making sure nonprofits are invested in and are able to do their work able to employ people, pay the wages, generate revenue for a community is vitally important to the success of our economy. We also know demand is up. We know costs are up. We know fundraising and funding remains the largest concern and challenge for nonprofit organizations in the state, and that we don't see unrestricted revenue or cash reserves growing. So this is all information we have in our annual nonprofit survey that we do. So, we need to make sure that people understand our value, but also how they can invest in us and make sure that we are contributing to this healthy economy and protecting our communities through the work that we do. All right, so very quick definitions for you. The first is advocacy, which is a very broad term, right? Any action that speaks in favor of, argues for a cause, supports, or pleads on behalf of others. You can see some examples of how we can do advocacy, the types of activities there on your screen. Lobbying is one specific kind of advocacy that we can do. And there's this definition at the federal level is communications that are intended to influence specific legislation by a legislative body, right? So in order to do lobbying work, we have to be talking to a body that passes, amends legislation about that particular legislation that they're doing. There's two different kinds. There's direct lobbying, where we ask people who are already a part of our organization to reach out on our behalf. And there's grassroots, where you're reaching out to people who don't really associate with your organization yet. So probably things like rallies, public service announcements, petition drives, that kind of thing. Everything else that you do, if you're talking to volunteers, donors, newsletter subscribers, that's all considered direct lobbying. And because it's such a big part of this lobbying definition, we have in here what legislation is specifically. This can happen at the local, state, or federal level, and it's actions by a legislative body or referendum questions that end up on the ballot. Because those are not candidate elections, they are legislation that's being voted on by the voting public. And so it still counts as legislation, and we can take a stand on it. If you're doing a lot of work at the state level, the definitions are slightly different. So it still includes this influencing legislative action, but it also includes influencing executive action. So if you are working with the governor's office or any of the agencies that fall under his purview, you'll also want to be tracking your lobbying work there. Still able to do it, still legal to do it, but just make sure you're tracking that when you are looking at your lobbying time. So the takeaway here is that all lobbying is advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying. There's lots of different ways that you can participate in advocacy work and helping to support your mission, support your organization in ways that doesn't necessarily involve lobbying unless you want to get into that. So I really encourage you all to think about, why advocacy might make sense for your organization. We always want to make sure we keep mission at the heart of what we're doing. We shouldn't advocate for things that are outside of our mission, but within that, there may be really good reasons why it's time for your organization to take a stand on either lobbying or general advocacy activities that will help support your mission. All right, so a few notes on what that looks like. How do we make sure that we're doing this in a legal way, right? 501c3 public charities, which probably most of you on the call are, that we are allowed to advocate. We're also allowed to lobby freely within specific limits. And there's two places that is codified for us. One is the 1976 lobby law, and the other is the 1990 IRS regulations. So if you're getting pushback from board members or other people who said it's not legal for us to lobby, that's not true. And you can refer them to the lobby law passed by Congress or the IRS regulations, which is our regulating body at the federal level. We can also influence legislation and ballot initiatives, but we do want to stay away from electioneering. And we also want to make sure, if we are an organization that receives federal grant funds, that we're not using that money to do your lobbying work. You have to have a separate revenue line to cover those lobbying expenses. If you work for or are funded by a 501c3 private foundation, so these are usually corporate foundations, family foundations, a group that's getting most of their revenue from one source, they are not allowed to lobby. They can do certain parts of advocacy work, but no lobbying there. They can still support your organization even if you lobby, but they're probably going to give you general operating grants or program grants that relates to your non-lobbying work. And then there are other 501c organizations that can participate in electioneering. That's why you might see like your local chamber of commerce endorsing candidates. They're probably a 501c6, and so they are allowed to participate in those kinds of activities. So a little bit more detail here on what that looks like. Unlimited amount of advocacy work that's not lobbying, right? There's no restrictions on the type of advocacy work we can do that does not include lobbying. We want to make sure we stay far away from endorsing candidates, either implicitly or directly. We want to make sure we stay away from contributing to campaigns, candidates, political action committees, rating candidates, especially as we walk into this 2026 election season, that we stay far away from anything related to the people that are elected to the office. We do have the ability to engage in some voter engagement activities, things like voter registration, get out the vote, candidate events, sharing policy or research with it, taking a position on a ballot measure or referenda. We have an entire voter education guide for nonprofits in Florida. If you are interested in this or you're doing this work, I highly recommend checking that out to make sure you're within the bounds there. And then we have limited amount of lobbying that we can do, both direct and grassroots. So if you're doing lobbying work, 2 ways to check that out, or to monitor what your limits would be in that way. The first is called the insubstantial part test. And this comes from the IRS legislation that says no substantial part of a charity's activities shall be carrying on propaganda or otherwise attempting to influence legislation. Great, right? Except for they never defined what insubstantial part meant, like how much is a substantial part. So it's sort of generally understood to be 3 to 5% of your annual expenditures. If you're doing occasional lobbying, it's probably fine for you to do it under this insubstantial part test. If you're going to be engaging in a little bit more lobbying work or lobbying work that's very public, I would encourage you to think about getting the Section 501H expenditure test. So this is an IRS form that you fill out. The number is 5768. And it sets, once you have that completed, it does create 1 extra page on your 990 form that you must complete each year, but it also gives you a very specific dollar amount that you stay below for your lobbying expenditures. And in most cases, it's going to be quite higher than this 3 to 5% of annual expenditures. So most people will fall well within those limits. And it gives you that peace of mind of really understanding exactly how much you can spend on your lobbying activities. So here's a little sample of what this might look like. Your exempt purposes expenditures is not exactly your operating budget. You would want to look at this with more nuance if you're going to look at this for your organization. But roughly, if you're a $500,000 organization, your total lobbying limit for the year would be $100,000. 25,000 of that could be grassroots lobbying. So remember, that's talking to people who are not a part of your organization right now. We can do less of that than we can direct lobbying. You don't have to do grassroots at all, but if you do, only 25,000 of that could be it out of your total lobbying limit of $100,000. If you're a $1 million organization, 175,000 would be your total lobbying limit for the year. No organization is allowed to spend more than $1 million on lobbying, no matter how large they are. But for most of us, we're going to be well under that. I will say, if you are getting into this lobbying work, no matter which way you choose, whether the insubstantial part test or the election H, make sure you have a system in place to track those lobbying expenditures so that if anyone asks questions, you are backed up and understand how to get that done. Okay, so I know I'm going through this quickly, but I want to make sure we have time for question and answers. We also do a longer class on this. If anybody's interested, I can share information on that, but this hopefully gives you a little bit of taste of where to go as you're thinking about your advocacy and lobbying work. So the first thing I would really encourage you to do, especially if you're not doing this work yet, is to think about how you prepare internally to do this lobbying and advocacy work in a really effective and ethical way. So the first thing that we recommend is really making sure you, your board, your leadership, your donors, anyone who cares about your organization understands why advocacy is important to your organization specifically. And one of the tools you can use for that is called an advocacy policy statement. So as an organization, you sit down and you think, why would this be important to us? How would this impact our mission? How does this change the impact we're able to have in the communities that we serve? What criteria do we use to decide whether or not we get involved? Who makes that decision? Is it the board? Is it the CEO? Is it a combination of the two? Do you have any expectations for the people who are advocating on your behalf? So like a code of conduct or understanding of how they use social media. And then are there things that you are not going to do, right? So we have a few samples here of what that looks like. These are all live links. When you get the slides, you'll be able to click through. I did pull out one. This is from the ARC's national website. They are a nonprofit that focuses on protecting people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And they have this posted very clearly on their national website of why they feel advocacy is vitally important for them to be able to protect the civil and human rights of people with IDD, right? So no one can come back and question, why are you spending your time and resources on this? We don't understand how it relates. They've made a very public statement that their board has approved that says, this is why it's vitally important to our mission. So having something like that can be really powerful. Also, going through the process of developing it gets everybody on the same page, gets your buy-in there so that everyone's ready to kind of move forward with your advocacy work. The next piece I would say is making sure you're creating a culture of advocacy. Probably most of you are doing some sort of fundraising work, right? And this is the big buzzword in the fundraising world, is create this culture of fundraising. Everyone in the organization is a fundraiser. Same idea here with advocacy, right? As long as we're keeping our mission at the core of what we're doing, and that we're doing all of our advocacy work with the utmost integrity and protecting our reputation, the leadership makes the decisions on what we do, but anyone can participate in it. And in fact, we're seeing that this is a great volunteer driver for our younger generations. So especially Gen Z is really interested in how they can contribute through advocacy in a volunteer role. So if you're looking to expand volunteerism at your organization, especially with younger generations, and you're also looking at advocacy, keep that in mind as you develop your program. We also sometimes get pushback from people on, like, my board is just not having it. Like, they say no, they don't understand, they think it's illegal, they don't want to put our organization at risk. So if you are in that position, a couple of things I would recommend. Number one, make sure that they do understand the laws, right? Share these slides with them or other resources that say how it's legal and what the limitations are. Lead them in their own discussion about why advocacy might be important for your organization, your mission, and your impact, because them getting to that conclusion on their own, that sort of process of going through that discussion, is also usually really powerful. And then if they're on board and they say, like, okay, what does that mean for me? I would recommend 3 places to really work with them. One is in creating the strategy, right? Just like they would help you with any other strategic planning or strategy setting for the organization. Working on advocacy strategy also falls into this board role. Once you have the strategy, making sure you have the budget and resources for it, right? Just like they would with any other part of the organization. And then finally, for those who are interested, getting personally engaged. Board members often are great people to connect you with elected officials, past elected officials, people running for office. They have those connections in the community. They can make that introduction and help them, the elected officials, learn a little bit more about the work that you do. I do want to acknowledge that sometimes deciding what your organization is going to get involved in is not as simple as like, oh, yes, that fits into our mission, or no, that's outside of our mission. There can be a lot of gray area when we get into the advocacy and lobbying space. Here's some examples of how that might work. So these are all made up. I did not pull these specifically from anyone's advocate agenda, but I just wanted to show how this gray area can sometimes pop up and why it's so important to know who's going to make these decisions at your organization. So for example, if I'm a part of a legal aid type of organization, would we advocate for student loan forgiveness? Potentially, right? We're probably hiring attorneys who have student loans, who are probably working for smaller salaries than they would be in the private sector. And so maybe we decide that internally for us, working to encourage student loan forgiveness or maintain the public service loan program, forgiveness program, makes sense because we need to be able to hire attorneys, right? We might also say, this has become a very political issue and we don't think this is the right time for us to stick our neck out in it. So we're going to step aside for right now, right? Investment in the public defender system. Once again, probably most legal aids would tell you a more robust public defender system is going to help them do their work. So this might seem like a no-brainer. There might be a situation at the local level, at the state level, where you think this is not the right time. Defunding the police. We're not hearing this language quite as much anymore, but 2020 and sort of the height of George Floyd murder and some of the conversations there, this was a big conversation. Would a legal aid nonprofit ever stand up and say we should defund the police? Probably not, right? Like that's not going to get them any favors when we look at being considered nonpartisan, making sure we're talking to both sides of the aisle. Are there pieces of the program under defunding the police that would make sense for them to be a part of? Potentially, right? They would need to look at each issue individually, decide for their particular organization if that makes sense. So you can kind of see how there's lots of conversations that happen here that might make sense. One more example, I'll just do the prevention of homelessness really quickly before we move on. You might think, right, if we're preventing homelessness, we definitely want to think about affordable housing. So that seems like a no-brainer. But when we think about things like addiction recovery funding or universal pre-K, we know those things are vitally important to the clients that we're serving, people that are experiencing homelessness. Is it the right time for us to advocate on behalf of those? Maybe, and maybe not, right? It depends on where we're located. It depends on what else is going on. It depends on what we're seeing in our particular client base at that particular time. So do those affect homelessness in some way? Yes. Do we advocate for them? Maybe, right? We get to decide at our own organization level in this particular moment in time if we do that or not. So hopefully that helps, demonstrate how it's not quite just a cut and dry decision. Sometimes you really do want to get into those nuances, play that tape all the way to the end and think about, is this going to help our mission, or is this something that we are better off stepping aside and waiting for a little bit or staying out of completely? All right, resourcing your advocacy work. So especially if you have not done a lot of advocacy and lobbying in the past, this is something new you're adding to your plate, right? I don't think many of us are sitting around like, wow, I wish I had more to do at work, right? That doesn't generally happen in the nonprofit sector. So if we are adding this to our workload, if we're adding this to the organization's work, we need to make sure that we can resource it properly. That probably means money, probably means staff time, probably means board focus or concentration. It may mean things like engaging outside resources like lobbyists or just having access to thought leadership in the area. So make sure you're thinking through this if you can ahead of time so that you don't get yourself in a position where you've just, again, put one more thing on your plate without really thinking through how we build our capacity for it. And then the last piece here on the internal side is starting to prep your messaging. I'll say it again. There's a lot of parallels here between advocacy and effective fundraising, right? Effective advocacy and effective fundraising have a lot of things in common, and that includes messaging. So if you're doing fundraising work at all right now and you're doing it somewhat well, you probably have some messages that you can use for advocacy with some slight tweaks. Some recommendations of where we say to, think to start on this advocacy messaging, talking about your economic impact. We do have this data on our website, and it does go all the way down to the county level. So if you want to share this information with your Hillsborough County Commission or Pinellas County Commission, you can pull that data and share exactly what the impact is for the nonprofit sector. It may be local stories of your mission work. Just make sure you're doing that in a way that doesn't re-traumatize any of the people that you are helping. Or talk about the importance of your mission, right? Like what's the need? What's the data that backs that up? How many people are utilizing your resource? How much money are you saving them by not having the government do it? That kind of thing, right? We have some infographics that we've prepared at the statewide level. I know the Nonprofit Leadership Center shared those recently in one of their newsletters. Happy to share those again, and happy also to kind of walk you through if you're like, I would love to use more data, but I'm not sure what would be relevant. Let me know, reach out. I'll be happy to kind of help you think through what we have access to that might help you strengthen your messages. And then my last piece for today is, ideally we've had a chance to kind of put all those internal pieces into place. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we're building the plane as we go down the runway, as the old saying goes. You may already doing advocacy work without any of those things. That's fine. You don't have to stop what you're doing. Just maybe think about adding some of those in. But eventually you're going to get to the point where you're ready to actually use your advocacy and lobbying work with external partners and building those relationships. Obviously, the group that you're most likely to be talking to are elected officials. So get to know them, think about, first of all, which level of government you need to target for your particular ask. Is it the local level? Is it the state level? Is it the federal level? Is it multiple levels? And then, get to know the people who are in those positions. Especially if they're at the state or federal level, they probably have a newsletter. They definitely have a website. You can sign up for communications, get to know their staff, which is vitally important. The staff are maybe sometimes even more important to know than the elected official themselves. Introduce your organization when you don't need anything, right? back to those fundraising practices that we talk about. Don't only reach out when you need money, right? That's we don't do cold calls for raising money. Same thing for advocacy. You want them to know and understand your work and your expertise before you need anything for them as much as possible, right? You can also think about how to engage in coalition work. That's often a really low risk, low expense way to start dipping your toes in the advocacy water and learn a little bit more about it. Ultimately, what we're looking for here is the ability to make these long-term, mutually beneficial, sustainable relationships with the people in office, with their staffers, and to also make sure that we are always staying nonpartisan, both in practice and appearance, because perception is reality, right? And we don't want to put our organizations at any kind of risk of seeming like we are taking a position that is one side or the other. We are focused on our mission work, we are focused on changing policy, and we're focused on that for the good of our mission and the communities that we serve. So when you're reaching out to elected officials, we have all the classic ways: letter writing, email writing, phone calls, reaching out through social media. I think, emails and phone calls are definitely the most common ways, and also things that all elected official offices count to see what they're hearing from constituents. Make sure you do your homework, make sure your message is clear and simple. Make sure, if you are a constituent, make sure you make that very clear. That's always going to hold more power than if you are not. And make very clear what it is you're asking for. Always follow up with thank you. Always stay respectful as much as possible. Once again, we want to rise above any politics to both protect our organization and to also make sure that our work is being heard by as many people as possible. And plan on having, if you're meeting with someone in person, plan on having 10 minutes or less to be able to get your thoughts across, right? So short meetings, very clear and simple language is always going to help there. You also have the ability to engage them proactively. So in Florida, we have part-time legislators at the local and state level. So as I said, right now, our state legislature is in Tallahassee, but the rest of the year, besides 60-day session and some of their committee weeks, they are home in their district, right? They're working their normal jobs and taking their kids to school and going to their religious services and volunteering for their organizations. So while they're there, invite them on a tour of your facility, go to their meetings that they're having, give them regular updates on what's going on, and make sure you are a resource for them if they are trying to learn more about the issue that you are experts on, that you're addressing. A couple other groups to keep in mind. One is the media. And so we can do advocacy through the media. Same thing here, right? Ultimately, we're looking to build these long-term mutually beneficial relationships. So really make sure that you understand what the media market is, that you get to know different reporters' beats, deadlines, expectations, what they're covering, and be responsive if they reach out and ask for information. This can really help you make sure you're getting the word out and that our perspective is being shared. I mentioned this earlier, but we can take a position on referenda. If you remember in the 2024 elections, I think there were 6 statewide amendments on the ballot that voters voted on. So, if it was relevant to your mission, you could have at that point said, and I don't remember which one is which, so this is not just to pick one over the other, but we support Amendment 1, we do not support Amendment 1, and this is why, right? As nonprofit organizations, we can do that because that's considered legislation. So as we look at the 2026 ballot and what might end up there, don't forget that if there's something that you find very harmful to your mission work or something very helpful to your mission work, it is an option that you have to come out and support or against those particular referenda on there. And then finally, I think it's always important to think about your funders as advocates for your organization, right? I mean, here's this group of people who have already committed to the work that you do, who probably have some influence and connections in the political world, and are looking for ways to interact with your organization besides that annual ask that you might make. Like, besides just give us more money, how can we engage funders in what we do? Advocacy might be a perfect way to do that. So really thinking about what could funders do on our behalf if they're interested in that, helping make introductions, going with you to meetings, giving you insight, is really a great way to think about not only engaging funders, but strengthening advocacy as well. And then I mentioned this already, but I can't stress enough how important I think coalition building is. There's coalitions all over the state and all over the country, some based on mission work, some based on geographic area, some based on sort of like common indicators that we're working on. If you're not yet engaged in coalition building and you are really interested in advocacy or lobbying work, I highly recommend thinking about getting involved in one, joining one, participating in their committee work, participating in a lobby day, and really understanding what it is that they do, how you can develop some of your individual leadership skills in this area. And it gives your organization a chance to kind of reach out, like I said, in usually a fairly low risk, low financial commitment kind of way. So that is what I have for today. I know I just like threw a ton of stuff at you. I'm going to grab some questions in just a minute. But I do want to emphasize again that as we think about advocacy and lobbying work for the sector, we always want to make sure that we remain nonpartisan. Our mission are too important to risk on politics, right? So in practice, and in appearance, we want to make sure that we are nonpartisan. We're talking about impact. We're talking about community needs. We're talking about mission work, right? And that line of how you describe that work is going to look very different for each organization. If you are an organization that's doing immigration work right now, it's much tougher for you than it is for someone who is doing mission work that is, kind of seen in a better light from the federal level right now. So really think about, what do we need? What can we realistically accomplish? And how do we make sure that those things all tie together for the betterment of our impact in the communities that we serve? Okay, so I'll pause there for just a minute and take some questions. I see there's one in the chat. Okay, so a bill is moving forward in Iowa that prohibits libraries from getting state funding if that state funding is being used to pay for membership of a state or national library association. Similar legislation in Florida. I have not heard of that specific legislation, but I will find out and let you all know about that. That has not come up, I don't think, yet from any of our other members. So let me find out from our lobbyist about that and I'll get back with you guys. All right. Do we have any suggestions as to how to create an effective C3, C4 collaborative integration? That's a great question. Yes, it is a little bit of a longer conversation. I'm not sure if you mean like within the same organization, if you're talking about separate organizations. Okay, in the same organization, yeah. So that is a model that has been used in the past. So a C3 is a public charity, right? So they're created to perform some kind of charitable purpose. A C4 organization is allowed to engage in a little bit more of the advocacy work. They're not considered a charitable organization. Donations to them are not tax deductible. There's some more legal differences, but that's sort of the broad overview. So a lot of C3, not a lot, but some C3 organizations create a C4 arm to help sort of balance out. I think one of the big examples is the American Cancer Society. Years ago, they also created a C4 organization called the Cancer Action Network to allow them to do a little bit more specific advocacy work. So it definitely can work. I think, it depends a little bit on what you're trying to accomplish, what kind of resources you have in place. Because when you start a new organization, C3 or C4, you're going to kind of need like resources to get that going, right? So happy to kind of have that conversation offline. I think it can be a really great tactic, but I think you would want to make sure that you are prepared to sort of support both organizations in infrastructure and financially before you kind of take that leap there too. Very short answer, but happy to finish that up offline too. All right, let's see what we got here. How do you advise we as nonprofit leaders help elected officials understand negative impacts on communities regarding their emotionally charged rhetoric and negative judgmental statements that divide communities, drive us apart from one another, and contribute to both? That's another really great question. I think it kind of goes back to what I said before. I think we have to always remember, number one, that advocacy is a long game for us, right? Sometimes we do see immediate movement and things are moving quickly because all the stars align and we're able to get things done very quickly. Most of the time, advocacy and lobbying is a long game that we're playing, right? We also have to remember that the work that we are doing, the mission work that we are doing, is so vitally important that it has to rise above any particular person or any particular rhetoric that's been sharing at this point in time. That can be very hard to do in practice, right? And it can be very frustrating to try to do that. I think sometimes that looks like finding your allies that are out there. Sometimes it may not feel like there's very many, but there's probably at least one on every elected body that we can find. Someone who really understands your mission work and what you're trying to accomplish to help tell your story, right? The media can also be a part of that, depending on the market that you're in. And I would caution that sometimes your allies aren't related to a particular political party or another, right? One of the examples I love to give is the current Senate president, President Albritton. On paper, maybe not somebody that most nonprofits would think would be super supportive of the work that they do. But one of his main focuses for his 2 years as Senate president is food insecurity, especially in rural areas, right? So if I am an organization that's working in that area and I have completely written him off as somebody who's going to support my work without really understanding what his priorities are, what personally affects him, I'm doing my organization a disservice, right? So it's very hard work. It's exhausting work. I know that. But I think we have to remain calm. We have to remain above the fray. We have to be consistent in the messaging that we share. And my other advice would be to really leverage in those relationships. So if you have board members or funders that have relationship with those elected officials who are using some of that rhetoric, ask them to have the conversation, right? Or ask them to connect you to them. It's almost always about word choice with us too. Sometimes we have to use words. We can't use words that we really would like to use that make the most sense for our mission work to try to just have them hear us in different ways. So it's not easy. I don't have any magic wand solutions, but keep fighting the good fight, keep above the fray as much as possible, and keep our message consistent with that. All right. Well, as you all think about some more questions, I have a couple other resource slides that I'll show, and I'll keep an eye on the chat as well. If you're specifically interested in some of the federal executive orders, we do have a webpage on our site called Federal News 2025, where you can find some updated information, including a link to that executive orders chart that the National Council of Nonprofits is doing. There's also a document they put together about what to do when your federal grant is terminated, if that's something that applies to you. We also have a survey open that if you are feeling effects from any federal changes, we would love to hear a little bit more about what that looks like specifically. We're trying to work with the media to get some of the stories out. We will maintain anonymity, as you know, if you would like that, it asks you questions about what you're comfortable sharing on the record or not. So that's all there for you. We also have some links here to our personal policy agenda for 2025 that we are looking at from the state level, along with links to all of our research. I mentioned a couple of the stats from our most recent Florida nonprofit survey, which just came out last month. And then our economic dashboard is on the bottom there. And then some more general resources. We do have an advocacy series coming up. If anyone wants to dive in a little bit deeper, you have other people at your organization you'd like to go into more depth, you can find all of that on our website or in the slides after here. And then finally, my last little plug for FNA would be, if you really don't know a whole lot about what we do or what kind of information we're sharing, subscribe to our newsletter. It's free. It comes out once a month. It gives you a lot of information about what's happening at the local, state, and federal levels, and just gives you a pretty good taste of like the kinds of things that we're monitoring, information that we're sharing, and resources that we provide. The presentation will be shared after the meeting. Isabella, I think you said you put it on the website, correct?
Yes, it will be posted on our website along with the recording of this, of the presentation.
Great. And then question, are there any 501c4 organizations who are doing education advocacy for early learning in K-12? I don't know the answer to that, but I will find out. 501c4. a comment. Successfully used one-page impact statements with Ben Albritton. He and other legislators want to see documented impact, both positive and negative, with sourced information plus personal impact. That's fantastic comment. Thank you, Bill. Very helpful. I hope you all do share that kind of information. And Bill, I don't know if at any point you'd be willing to share a little bit of what that one-page impact statement looked like, but that might be helpful too to your colleagues to see that. But thank you for sharing that. Great. All right. Well, I'm going to put my email address up here. If you all have any individual questions that you want to chat about, if you need help thinking through data or research and how you can use that in your messaging, anything at all, please feel free to reach out. Appreciate all of you all, your questions and your comments. And yeah, thank you, NLC, for having us today.
A big thank you to you, Leah, for sharing this incredibly informative and timely presentation. Thank you to everyone that joined us today. Like we said, we will be sharing the recording and the slide deck in the next week, a few days, so be on the lookout for that. Feel free to reach out to Leah if you have any questions. You can also reach out to us and keep an eye out for any upcoming webinars. We have 2 other free webinars this month, so make sure you check those out. Thank you so much. Bye.